All right, let's just dive right into this. When you and I picture the American Revolution, it is so incredibly easy to just imagine it as this grand, inevitable march toward liberty, right? Like it was just this story of righteous destiny. But the actual reality on the ground, it was anything but. In this explainer, we are going to completely shatter that myth. I want to plunge you into a desperate, multifactional, global war of attrition, where the outcomes were entirely unknown, the risks were absolute, and literally every single decision carried devastating consequences. You see, this wasn't just some localized tax revolt. It was a precarious crucible that reshaped the entire world.
Picture this. It's the fall of 1780. The Continental Army is freezing, they are starving, and they are severely short of weapons, food, and clothing. The war had basically devolved into a bloody, miserable stalemate. The rebellion wasn't thriving at this point. It was teetering on the terrifying brink of total collapse. The fact that there was even an army left in the field at all was due almost entirely to the sheer magnetic charisma and leadership of George Washington. I mean, they were, in the exact words of the men freezing in those camps, quite literally running on faith, hope, and promises. So that begs a pretty massive question, doesn't it? How on earth did a collapsing rebellion actually win against the greatest empire on the planet? Well, to figure that out, we have to look past the battlefield heroism and really zoom out. The survival of the United States wasn't destiny at all, and it only starts to make sense when we realize that this wasn't just America's war. Which brings us to part one, the hidden board, a global proxy war. Let's be real, these major European powers didn't just jump into the fray because they suddenly became champions of democracy. No, they had very specific, highly calculated geopolitical motives. France wanted to regain its global prestige after the 7 Years' War and severely weaken Britain. So they secretly supplied 5 million leaves to the Americans and later committed 5,500 ground troops and absolutely vital naval parity. Spain, meanwhile, had zero interest in American independence, but they really wanted Florida and Gibraltar back. So they fought along the Gulf Coast, which crucially diverted British fleets away from the colonies. And the Dutch Republic? Well, they wanted free trade and profit. They offered massive financial loans and kept essential smuggling routes wide open. And you really have to grasp the sheer scale of that foreign reliance. Get a load of this number, 50%. Half of all revolutionary military supplies were smuggled through the tiny Dutch Caribbean island of St. Eustatius. The Dutch were making massive profits. We're talking up to 120% on gunpowder alone, and they cleverly hid it in barrels marked as tea, rice, and molasses just to bypass British blockades. Think about that for a second. Without this massive underground global supply chain, Washington's army would have literally been completely out of ammunition. All right, let's shift gears to part two, the fractured continent, a devastating civil war. Take the powerful Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, for example. Initially, they tried really hard to just maintain neutrality. Back in 1775, they actually told American agents that they considered the conflict a family affair and said they would take absolutely no part in the quarrel. But the immense, crushing pressures of the war completely fractured this centuries-old alliance. The Cayuga, Mohawk, Onondaga, and Seneca ultimately sided with the British, while many Oneida and Tuscaroras supported the Americans. It transformed the revolution into this bitter, heartbreaking civil war among the Six Nations themselves, with former allies and brothers actually fighting one another on the battlefield. The human cost here is just absolutely staggering. Consider the Stockbridge Indians of Massachusetts. They made common cause with the colonists, fighting as Minutemen and Continental soldiers to protect their own sovereignty. But in August of 1778, a company of Stockbridge Indians was ambushed by British forces near Kingsbridge, New York. Up to 40 Indian soldiers were killed, which absolutely devastated their community. And the tragic aftermath of all this? The widows of those fallen soldiers endured desperate poverty and were blatantly denied the bounty lands that were promised to other Continental veterans. When they petitioned Congress for the fair treatment they were owed, they were completely unsuccessful. Now we move to part three, the parallel war for liberty and weaponizing emancipation. In 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, declared martial law. He promised freedom to any enslaved person owned by a patriot who was willing to bear arms for the British. Think about the sheer panic this caused for patriot planters. To them, this was their most terrifying nightmare come to life. It was an assault on their property and the looming threat of a racial insurrection. But listen, Dunmore didn't do this out of some moral objection to slavery. He simply needed soldiers to win a war. Tragically, for the estimated 800 to 2,000 escaped slaves who actually reached him, Dunmore's grand dream of a massive Ethiopian regiment was totally shattered. Brutal outbreaks of smallpox and typhoid fever decimated these men, women, and children as they were forced to gather in incredibly cramped, claustrophobic British encampments and ships. Fast forward 4 years to 1779, and things escalate big time. British General Henry Clinton issues the Philipsburg Proclamation, taking Dunmore's initial idea and drastically expanding it. This decree promised security, land, and freedom to any Patriot-owned slave who escaped to British lines. And get this, with no military service required. Once again, this was a ruthless engine of economic warfare specifically targeting the rebellion's workforce. It is absolutely crucial to note that it deliberately did not free slaves who were owned by loyalists. That fact alone reveals this as a cold, calculated military tactic, rather than any sort of genuine abolitionist movement. To really wrap our heads around the reality of this massive policy, let's look at one specific person, Eleanor Fleming. She was enslaved by a tenant right at Philipsea Manor in New York, which, incredibly, is the exact place where General Clinton issued the proclamation. Taking immense, life-threatening personal risk, Eleanor self-emancipated. She seized this incredibly narrow, dangerous window of opportunity to claim her own freedom right in the middle of the chaos of a global war. And the thing is, Eleanor was far from alone. An estimated 100,000 enslaved people escaped to British lines. Just sit with the sheer unprecedented scale of that demographic upheaval for a moment. 100,000. It was one of the earliest examples of large-scale emancipation in the colonies, and it completely upended the social structure of the era. Finally, Part 4, the hollow victory, and the terrifying reality of surviving the peace. So the war is won, right? But the United States' first attempt at a functioning government was the Articles of Confederation. And honestly, its flaws were catastrophic. The founders were so paranoid and terrified of a strong central government like Britain's that they basically created a giant power vacuum. Congress couldn't impose taxes to pay off their monumental war debts. They couldn't regulate trade, so states just started slapping ridiculous tariffs on each other. And most dangerously of all, Congress couldn't even raise its own army. It had to rely entirely on state militias. It was a completely disorganized, profoundly vulnerable new nation. And because of that vulnerability, the post-war tension escalated incredibly rapidly. By 1784, literally just a year after the peace treaty was signed, the British were already infringing on American fishing rights and impressing American sailors into forced conscription. And what could Congress do? Absolutely nothing. They were entirely impotent to stop it abroad. Meanwhile, back at home, a harsh, brutal economic depression was absolutely crushing everyday citizens. So you have to ask yourself this terrifying question: what happens when a government literally cannot defend itself from its own people? In 1786, Shays' Rebellion erupts in Massachusetts. You have struggling, desperate Revolutionary War veterans rising up against harsh tax collections and brutal debt policies. And the national government? They were literally too broke to commission an armed force to stop them. They had no money, and they had no military. Period. So how was the rebellion actually put down? Well, get this. It took a group of wealthy Massachusetts merchants pooling their own private resources to pay for a militia. Really think about that for a second. The national government failed completely. It made it undeniably, glaringly clear that the Articles of Confederation were futile. This terrifying internal threat, the very real fear of total anarchy and collapse from within, was the ultimate catalyst that forced these leaders back to the drawing board to create the U.S. Constitution. So at the end of all this, we are left to ponder a pretty massive question. Was the true cost of sovereignty paid on the battlefield, or was it paid in the devastating social, political, and economic fractures left behind? The American Revolution, as we've seen, wasn't some neat, inevitable victory. It was a highly precarious crucible of global proxy wars, fractured native nations, weaponized emancipation, and a government that nearly tore itself to pieces the second it achieved peace. It's a messy, living, breathing history of survival that altered civilizations forever. I really hope this explainer gave you a totally new lens on the complex reality of the revolution. Until next time, keep questioning the past.